I think the Puerto Rico referendum was a disservice. One, to the people of Puerto Rico. Two, to the 308 million American citizens. Four, to the cause of statehood. I think this governor, Luis Fortuño, will go down in history as the disaster of disasters, of the perfect hurricane for Puerto Rico, just like we just saw Sandy in New York, that nobody would ever expect that a hurricane would have that kind of devastation on Staten Island and New Jersey on the shores of those two states. So we have a perfect storm that occurred. And the reason why it's a perfect storm is that it's worse than if nothing had happened. If nothing had happened, you could always have the pretext, the excuse of saying, well, you know, if you give us the opportunity to choose, we'll choose statehood. Well, you have the opportunity to choose, and here's what happened. Out of 3,700,000 people, there are 2,300,000 that are registered to vote. Of those, less than 2 million, maybe 1,800,000, 1,900,000 voted. And of those, 640,000 chose statehood. That's a third of the people who voted, and 25% of the total registered electorate, whether they voted or not, they have a right to vote. 25%. So how can you claim that as a victory when in the past, statehood has always gotten, in the last two referendums, 46%. 46% is the traditional number of people in Puerto Rico that want statehood. Now it's 33%. How can that be a victory? That's a Pyrrhic victory. And to make matters worse, the person that gets elected as governor of the opposition party is strongly opposed to statehood, viscerally opposed to statehood. He won by 15,000 votes. Out of 1,800,000 votes cast, the man wins by 15,000 votes. Luis Fortuño, instead of trying to get himself a cabinet position in the Romney presidency, struck out 3 times. 1, Romney lost. 2, he lost. And to me, most important, statehood lost. And not only did it lose, it lost for a generation. I don't think the issue of statehood will come to discussion in my lifetime. And I hope to live another 15 or 20 years. So in other words, in the next 20 years, this is gone. So it's another generation. It'll be my grandchildren or the grandchildren of my cousins, because I voted with my feet. I live in Florida. I've lived in Florida for close to 60 years, okay? Since I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Miami and stayed. Well, guess what? There are close to 1 million Puerto Ricans in Florida, and the record now is 12 to 15,000 every year moving from the island. That doesn't count the people that come from New York and New Jersey and Chicago that are Puerto Ricans moving to Florida. We don't know how many there are, but the estimate is that it's at least 30,000 total from the island and from the mainland that move to Florida every year, which means that by 2016, which is the next presidential election, we will have more Puerto Ricans than Cubans that will be registered to vote. Remember, all Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens at birth. So it's not a question of waiting 5 years and it's just a question of registering. If you're old, if you're 18 and you want to register and you're a Puerto Rican living in Florida, you have 100% citizens' rights. The people of Puerto Rico, a U.S. citizen, a blonde, blue-eyed, freckled-eyed, Irish descendant who lives in Orlando that moves to Puerto Rico immediately becomes a second-class U.S. citizen. That's not the intention of the U.S. Constitution, but that's the practical effect of where we are. So the question is, well, why doesn't Congress then give Puerto Rico independence? Well, because we live in a democracy, and a democracy is based on the consent of the governed. That's principle number 1 of any democracy is an election, and then 2, the consent of the governed. That's part of the same picture. How can 3% of the people of Puerto Rico want independence? How can you have 3% dictate to 97% what they're to do? That's like telling a woman who doesn't want to have an abortion that she must have an abortion because the government has a policy that each family could only have one child. China. Forced abortions. Not in the United States, not in a democracy, not in a civilized country. You can't force a woman to have an abortion. That has nothing to do with Roe versus Wade. That's a basic premise of Western society. You cannot take away a life of another person against their will. I mean, that's murder. You cannot force independence on the people of Puerto Rico if they want to be U.S. citizens. So what happens is you end up going to limbo. And so what Luis Fortuño has done is he has destroyed the dream of statehood for a generation. And maybe forever, who knows?